On March 12th of this year, our city and local area began closing down due to the coronavirus. This reality created disruption and confusion and grief for all of us. It has been a universal reset. On May 25th, George Floyd was killed in broad daylight by a Minneapolis police officer. And in the context of an already stressed out culture, we have been faced with conflict and calls for justice that strike at the very heart of our racial divides. All of this has combined for a profound sense of loss. We have lost our rhythms in life. We've lost our connection with people beyond our immediate family. We have lost vitality, replaced by an exhaustion unlike any we've known. And we have been forced to deal with it in an unfamiliar context: social distance. Two words that none of us had probably ever used before this year. Now, this is, of course, all the bad news that you are all too familiar with already. And you didn't come today for bad news, you came for good news, because we are, after all, people of good news. So here's the good news. There is hope. There is hope that is within your capacity and my capacity to attain. Hope that can be discovered and leveraged through the ancient practice of Sabbath. Hope for a world healed of a virus called corona, and hope for a nation healed of a virus called racism. Now, I know the word Sabbath will land differently for each of you, so let me be clear what we're talking about. First, what Sabbath is not. Sabbath is not the same thing as vacation. Sabbath is not all about you, and it's not all about me. Sabbath is not a religious ritual, but Sabbath is a spiritual discipline. Sabbath is a commandment within our faith tradition. It's one of the Big Ten. Sabbath is sacred and holy. Sabbath is rest, and it's routine, and it is a rhythm. Sabbath is transformational, and it can bring a healthy dose of hope. As a working definition for our purposes, Sabbath is uncluttered time and space in which we can distance ourselves from our own activities enough to see what God is up to. Now, if you've been hanging around Wayzata Community Church long enough, you might remember that 5 years ago, our entire Lenten series focused on the concept of Sabbath. It was a meaningful and enriching time for many of us. But just as much as the world around us has changed since 2015, we have changed also as individuals. So for the next 2 weeks, we're going to look at the experience of Sabbath today in the context of a pandemic, and then next week as it relates to our racially divided world. So let me begin where I always begin, in Scripture. Throughout the Gospels of our New Testament, we see Jesus regularly practicing Sabbath. His ministry began by being led by the Spirit into the wilderness. He regularly entered into Sabbath when he had to make big decisions. In the context of Sabbath, he dealt with troubling emotions and learned how to step away from the demands of his ministry to care for his own soul. Sabbath was the space where Jesus taught the disciples and prepared for major events in his ministry, including his eventual death on a cross. I'm going to focus on Mark's gospel because Mark is always in a great big hurry. 39 times in Mark's gospel, biblical translators use the word immediately. Even in the context of the shortest and fastest moving of our 4 gospels, even Mark knows to slow down and to create that uncluttered time and space in which we can distance ourselves from our own activities enough to see what God is up to. Now, zooming in even more closely, I want to look today at the 6th chapter of Mark's Gospel. I believe it to be a fair reflection of our own lives in many ways and filled with very teachable moments. The chapter begins with Jesus in his hometown, where he was met with disbelief and dishonor. Shaking the dust from his feet, he takes the 12 disciples out on their first mission, and he sends them out 2 by 2. It's a time of great activity and enthusiasm, but in the midst of that, Jesus learns of the death of his cousin, John the Baptist, and he grieves deeply. Nevertheless, the crowds keep coming. They keep finding Jesus and his disciples no matter where they go. One time, they showed up with no food, and so he has to feed 5,000 people with a single miracle. After that miraculous feeding, still in Mark 6, Jesus sends the disciples away by boat, joining them later by walking on the water. But as soon as they land back on shore, we hear these words in the final verses of Mark 6. When he got out of the boat, people at once recognized him and rushed about that whole region and began to bring the sick to wherever they heard he was. And wherever he went, into villages or cities or farms, they begged him that they might touch even the fringe of his cloak. All this activity in just one chapter of Mark. Jesus giving and giving and giving of himself to the world, grieving the death of his cousin, and being dishonored by his own hometown. He is depleted and weary and in need of rest. He is in need of Sabbath. Now, working backward in that same chapter, I want to lift up just 3 examples of Sabbath for Jesus to begin answering the question why Sabbath matters for us also. The first purpose of Sabbath for Jesus and for all of us is rooted in the frenetic pace of his life and ministry. That first purpose is rest. The same is true for us, of course, each in different ways as we have endured this pandemic. Pre-COVID, and now differently in the context of COVID, psychologist Richard Swenson observes that we are a nation on the move and in a hurry. We are people of the stampede. We eat fast food during rush hour. We ship by FedEx. We place calls through Sprint. We balance our books on Quicken, and we diet with Slim Fast. We are hyper-living like field mice on amphetamines at harvest time, moving so fast we're passing up photons. Our global treadmill is equipped with an automatic advancing speed rheostat, and every year the world spins faster. We need rest. That description would be funny if it wasn't so painfully true. And now, more than ever, and in all new ways due to this pandemic, we need uncluttered time and space in which to simply rest. Jesus said, "Come unto me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." Sabbath, in its very best form, provides a deep and different kind of rest. It has the potential of what I call a power nap. Starting in college, I perfected the art of the power nap, a 20-minute break, anywhere, anytime. I can close my eyes for 20 minutes and feel completely refreshed and renewed. Sabbath is a power nap for our souls. Of course, our American work ethic makes it very difficult to rest without feeling guilt. If this pandemic has taught us anything, it has taught us that we can work smarter without working more. Study after study shows that fewer hours of work can prove to be more productive than just more and more hours of work. And speaking of Sabbath rest, our church leaders have decided to give our entire staff a break by closing the building for this week leading up to the 4th of July and sending everyone home to rest. The second purpose of Sabbath for Jesus in his day and for all of us in the context of a pandemic is to deal with our grief. For Jesus, it was the death of his cousin, John the Baptist, who was beheaded as the fulfillment of a birthday gift to Herodias. In the context of his grief, verse 30 of Mark 6 says that the apostles gathered around Jesus, and he said to them, "Come away to a deserted place all by yourselves." Like Jesus, we are all grieving. We all need to come away to a deserted place because something, and perhaps many things, have ended before we were ready for them to end. And as I said since the beginning of this pandemic, we must attend to our grief. This grief. We must intentionally work through all the stages of grief, being careful not to go too fast or too slow. How do we know? Sabbath. Sabbath gives us the uncluttered time and space within which to see what God is up to, just like it did for Jesus. The third and final purpose of Sabbath for Jesus, as related to us in Mark 6, is the creation of margin. Margin is the space between our load and our limits. This marginal space is vital to our health and creativity and resilience. Having margin makes a flourishing life sustainable. Among the great enemies of margin is urgency. Eugene Peterson says that we must ruthlessly eliminate urgency from our lives, for urgency is the enemy of spirituality. Without the margin created by Sabbath, we risk becoming human Rube Goldberg machines, with just one thing causing or leading right into the next thing, from one meeting or one event or one Zoom call or one task or just one more thing on our to-do list, right straight into the next. But margin doesn't just happen. Margin is one of the many benefits we experience when we embrace the spiritual practice of Sabbath. So, with the purposes of Sabbath as seen in Mark 6, rest, grieving, and margin, and with Sabbath as critical to our thriving in a pandemic, let me close with just 3 quick thoughts on how you might practice Sabbath starting today. The model of Jesus shows us that first we come away and then pray and do it every day. That's it. Time and again, Scripture says that Jesus and the others would come away to a quiet place. That may be very easy for you, or it might be very deeply difficult, but try we must to find a quiet spot in our own home or our own yard or up the street on a path or in a park, or if you're blessed with access to the great north of Minnesota, find a quiet place, come away, and then pray. To pray is to just be with God for the while, nothing more and nothing less. Don't be intimidated by prayer. There's no wrong way to do it, except to not do it at all. And the final encouragement is in the practice of Sabbath is to do it every day. Come away, then pray, and do it every day. It need not be for very long, but setting a rhythm and establishing a routine just as Jesus did is critical. The Sabbath commandment is the only one that begins with the word remember. It's almost as if God thought we might forget. The best way to not forget is to make sure we do it every day. In this way, we will assure that every day and every week and every month contains everything we need to see what God is up to. No one keeps or practices Sabbath better than our Jewish sisters and brothers. And there is a traditional saying, it is not so much that the Jews have preserved the Sabbath, but that the Sabbath has preserved the Jews. I began today with the bad news that we are all too well aware of, but I conclude with a reminder that we are people of good news, and we have within our capacity to attain hope through the gift of Sabbath. Next week, we'll consider the purpose and place of Sabbath in our efforts to do justice, particularly in these days of deep racial divide. Join me.